Tu Weiming has traveled the world to share his brand of Neo-Confucianism, culminating in an invitation from Kofi Annan to address the UN on dialogue among civilizations. Confucius himself, who wandered far and wide in the 6th and 5th centuries BC to spread his message, would surely applaud. He first came into contact with Confucianism as a teenager, and his passion for its doctrines stayed with him ever since. And in his 30s, he became a professor of Chinese history, Chinese culture, and Confucian studies at Harvard. Though the origins of Confucianism date back thousands of years ago in China, he argues Confucian studies still not only have its significance in contemporary China, but also are ripe for revival. And today we talk to Professor Tu Weiming, Dean of the Institute of Advanced Humanistic Studies of Peking University and a leading proponent of Neo-Confucianism. Professor, good to see you in Icon.
Nice to see you.
Well, this is a beautiful campus, Peking University. You're now the Dean of the Institute of the Advanced Humanistic Studies.
Yes.
Well, you actually helped establish this institute.
I tried to do it about 5 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
What are you trying to achieve with this institute?
Well, actually, it was just a dream that I would like to see that not just Confucian studies, but humanistic studies broadly defined will have a place at one of the leading universities in China. And the primary goal for me actually was try to learn and try to reestablish my contact with scholars in China. Normally I knew about them by reputation. And if there's a chance of reintroducing some of the more positive salient features of the tradition, that may turn out to be a very useful thing, both for me and for the Chinese cultural community as a whole. Right. That's why I decided to leave Harvard, where I taught for more than 30 years.
That's right. You taught in Harvard, in Princeton, in UC Berkeley.
UC Berkeley, right.
Exactly. But Tu always knew the end of his journey was to come full circle and bring the sage's message back home. In 2010, he officially opened the Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University. As the founding dean, he finally had the headquarters he sought to communicate with Chinese scholars about Confucianism. I would say my generation, even my previous generation, or even younger than me, they don't know much about Confucianism. Well, Confucianism is still, as we know it, the foundation of the series of theories that shaped who we are basically in China.
Right.
Are you disappointed with what's happening with the status quo with Confucianism?
Not at all. And I'm not a naive optimist, but I'm a realist. And I try to think with practice. In other words, it's not just abstract thinking about what's going on. So I observe what actually happened. When I studied Confucianism as a teenager in Taiwan, the environment there was very different. And I became interested not because it was good for my career. In fact, many people consider that as a very detrimental to a career where I, at the time when I majored in other subjects such as English literature, that was considered as a bright future. But I became naturally attracted because of the intrinsic persuasive power of a way of thinking. It's not a religion. It's not a philosophy in the Greek sense. It's a way of life. Now, let me be a little bit philosophical. Everyone, in a way, is learning to be human. We're not just human beings as a given entities. We're in the process of learning to be human. And that process involves constantly asking questions, looking for new knowledge, internalizing new skills. But much more important is to try to build our own character, what we consider to be positive aspects of our life. And Confucianism addresses this central question about learning, not just acquisition of knowledge, but learning to become a better person. Of course, you have many ways of being a better person. So this is the reason why you have this interesting feeling. It's very familiar, and then it's very alien. It's all over the place, and yet it's difficult to find it.
That's absolutely true. I mean, when I said we didn't really have much information or knowledge about, you know, the doctrines or the classics, but at the same time, we'll have to admit that we are being influenced, actually, by the classics, by Confucianism, in the way we don't really actually realize. But again, I mean, you said when you were a teenager, you fall in love with all these classics and Confucianism. You found it interesting. But still, you said it's philosophical. It is indeed philosophical. So can you explain to us, or maybe to our viewers, what exactly is Confucianism?
Right. This is the question, is it a religion? Oh, certainly.
Is it?
Not, in a way, it's not like Christianity, Buddhism, or Islam. These are three great religions in the world. It's philosophical, but it's not like Greek philosophy. And it is a way of life. It has profound spirituality. In other words, the Confucian tradition has reverence. Reverence to heaven, to earth, to the nation, to parents, to teachers, and to actually all the things around us. And some people say it's sort of pantheism. It's not. It's just a sense of reverence, is an attitude towards oneself. Reverence for our own life, for example. So it is a process of learning to be human that is open, hopefully, to every human being. Unlike other animals, the difference between a human being and an animal is we are all self-consciously reflecting upon what we do. That's why Socrates' idea, an unexamined life is not worth living. So we examine, we're being conscious. We communicate with other people. We look at the world, we have our worldview, even though we do not necessarily talk about our worldview. We all have worldview. We all have some very basic ways of relating to people. Now, there's one very simple idea, but to put into practice, it could be extremely complicated. Simply, 己所不欲，勿施于人. I would not impose on others what I would not like others to be imposed on me, which is different from, say, the Christian idea, do to others what you want others to do to you. Two different things, but each has its own strengths. For years, people criticized the Confucian position as very passive. You just do not do to others, rather than doing to others. But this idea actually is based upon respect for the integrity of the others, respect for the preferences, ideas of others. For example, if I know what the good word is, or the gospel, the good word is, and I would like to share that with you, I feel I'm obligated to do that. And if I do not know whether that's what you want or not, by simply imposing my goodwill on you, that will generate some kind of conflict. A Christian and Muslim both want to share the good news, and both have very different ways of interpreting the good news. Therefore, there's conflict. So in the dialogue among civilizations, the Confucians begin with the idea, do not impose what you consider the best to others. And you first understand what the others really want. So this is the spirit of tolerance. With tolerance, then you begin to appreciate. In other words, you first try to listen to what the others would, really would like to offer as a basis. So many of the statements in the Confucian tradition are commonsensical. First try to establish and help others to establish themselves, instead of being simply an egoist, simply try to benefit my own interest. You know, right now many people criticize the new generation of brilliant Chinese. They are very elegant, self-interest oriented people. They're very elegant, yet they are focused on self-interest. Now, the Confucian tradition is Yes, self-interest is absolutely necessary. The limit. You need to expand that self-interest to a family, hopefully to strangers and to the world, to people you normally do not know. So there's something very basic in terms of our felt experience. At the same time, it also wants to expand so that the human community can become more harmonious. The only way to go is dialogue, is to understand that what I cherish is not necessarily the best for everybody.
So what is the relevance now of Confucian values in a contemporary China?
All these turn out to be negative features. So we need a new way of searching for a cultural identity.
Whether as the Dean of the Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University or in his previous capacity as the director of Harvard Yenching Institute, Tu has written dozens of books on his cherished creed, setting out why it can still do so much to make society and the world a better place. So it's more like all these principles concerning self-cultivation.
Yes.
How to be a better person.
Right.
But the thing is, at the same time, there seems to be the clash of Chinese traditional values.
Yes.
Like Confucian values and also Western values.
Right.
And actually since maybe early last century,
right,
the campaign's been there, say, well, Confucianism's been there for thousands of years, but it's
right,
no good anymore
right,
for a modern society in China. We should actually abandon this.
Right.
We should replace that with
Absolutely.
Western values.
Right, right. In the mid-19th century, when China in a way collapsed, militarily first, then politically, institutionally, and cultural identity was lost, there's a sense that nothing we can do. We cannot do anything. The only thing we can do is to abandon what we cherish as our own tradition and try to become totally new. By being new is by to learn from something alien, something very different. You pointed out some of the Western values in the modernizing process, recognized by these scholars, such as rationality, freedom,
human rights,
the due process of law, dignity of the individual, and all these are great values. And they believe you have to internalize these values before you can actually compete with the West. So the change is from a seek for certain harmony, certain conciliation, to competitiveness. And so the Confucian idea, in my view, addresses some perennial, recurring human concerns. You cannot have a society without some of the very basic principles of being decent, being responsible, being obligated not only to yourself but to your family and others, and being polite, being civil. And so one of the core values in the Confucian tradition is Ren, humanity. And humanity means a life force which can be rendered as sympathy or commiseration. And we realized in a curious way that in the last 50 years, some of the most brilliant minds in the West began to question about the value of modernity, no matter how modernity is understood from our point of view, is wealth and power. Why they question that? Well, they question that because some of them are feminists. They believe that some values, gender equality is being sacrificed. They're also environmentalists. They realize that nature is being plundered. And some people are communitarianists. They understand the community more important than simply the isolated individuals. So they're against sort of anthropocentrism, that is focusing on human. They're against egoism. They're against fierce competitiveness, which only benefits the interest of a very small minority.
The most complete record of Confucius' mindset is contained in the Analects, and many Chinese are familiar with his 5 core values for humanity: empathy, righteousness, justice, wisdom, and trust. Tu says this still serves as a blueprint for peaceful coexistence of peoples and nations. So what is the relevance now of Confucian values in a contemporary China?
Right now, we know how important culture is. And normally, we consider culture as a superstructure. The most important thing is economics. And the best way to evaluate economics is GDP. And the growth can be visually demonstrated. In 2013, China decided to move beyond GDP and to include political development, social development, and even cultural development and ecological development. That, to me, is a very important turning point. We're now looking at a whole person. If we are very wealthy and we are very competitive and our air is polluted, our food is polluted, our water is polluted, our lifestyle is polluted, and society is not equal, and also a very small group of people has incredible power and influence, and the rest of the people feel somehow helpless, and fairness is being questioned. All these turn out to be negative features. So we need a new way of searching for a cultural identity.
Well, we talked about the power of a culture, and
Right.
everyone is talking about, say, soft power.
Yes.
Well, that seems to be a very popular jargon, but at the same time, people, well, in other countries might not feel comfortable about this word. And if there is a diplomat from other countries
Right.
or scholars from other countries saying the same thing to Chinese people, we might not feel that comfortable with the word either. I mean, it sounds kind of invasive, sounds aggressive. So what is your understanding of the power of culture?
Yes. And soft power actually is coined by a colleague of mine at Harvard, Joe Nye. When he used this idea, he, at the time, was addressing the American problem. There's no question about America militarily extremely strong, financially also very powerful, and yet America is not respected, not even in Europe after 9/11. And America didn't seize the opportunity to recreate a new vision for the global world. They became more self-interested, they are more selfish, more dominating, more hegemonic. So he said, what we need is a soft power. It's not just military power, it's not just financial power. And I actually objected to the idea of power, because power manipulates. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what we need is to develop very basic ethics of human interaction, especially in the world today, what we consider the world as multicultural. So cultural diversity has to be accepted. There's no way to believe that in the future there's only one power or one tradition, one culture that dominates the world. There are many, many powers emerging. So I even envision the possibility of multiple modernities, not just one way. There are many, many globalizations, not just one way. So with all these different ways, the only way to go is dialogue, is to understand that what I cherish is not necessarily the best for everybody. And with the dialogue, dialogue is not to convert. It's not to force others to follow my way. It is not even simply to try to exchange, to correct mistakes other people may have for you. What is the purpose? Ideally, the purpose is to cultivate the art of listening, to listen to the others. I think Americans have already lost this ability. The Chinese has tremendous ability of listening. This is one of the great strengths in the Confucian tradition.
Part of the Confucian values.
The Chinese character Sun, the sage, in the simplified character is Youtu, right? But in this non-simplified form is with the ear, with the mouth, and we say orator. But the sage is also a great listener. Confucius said at the age of 60, I could follow, my ears became obedient. In other words, I could listen to all kinds of noises, but I don't make any kind of prejudgment. So that art of listening, tolerance also, is a very, very important attribute of Chinese culture in general. That's the reason in this land, religious conflicts rarely occurred. If they occurred, these were minor incidents, not major confrontations. And very early on, Confucianism interacted with Buddhism, and of course earlier with Taoism, with legalism, with yin-yang traditions, and the great Confucian thinker Dong Zhongsu became a great synthesizer. And he became the major ideologist for the Han Dynasty. But Zhu Xi in the Song Dynasty also tried to combine many different traditions. That's why we call three teachings in one, not just Confucianism, but Taoism and Buddhism. I visited Denfeng quite a few times. You know, the place is called the Tiandi Zizhong, where the Shaolin Temple, where the Zhongyue Miao, and also the Songyang Shuyuan, one Confucian, one Buddhist, one Taoist.
Really, they coexist.
Not only coexist, but live in the same city, and we have a lot of fruitful interactions among them. And this tolerance of being able to, there's also we call dual membership, which I think is very familiar to us. I can be a Confucian, but at the same time a Buddhist or a Taoist. And for example, if you go to the temples now, especially in Taiwan, most of the Buddhist monks lecture on Confucian ethics. They lecture on, not to lecture to ask you to leave the world, to become a monk, and to find the other shore. They ask you to be filial, to be diligent, to be good citizen, to be a kind-minded people. So these kind of interactions are very important.
You are by all means a Confucianist.
My life history, my personal life history, is intertwined with Confucianism and how you define it.
See, the revival of traditional values. So many classes now are being designed to educate the young kids with the classics. How do you see this?
This is, I think, a cultural renaissance. In the long run, it could turn out to be extremely consequential.
Well, you're by all means a Confucianist. Is that the right word to say it? Confucianist?
You say Confucian, and you know, it's very embarrassing in this context. If you are a Christian, you say, I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
Even the lion is going to devour you, you say, I'm a Christian, right? That may be true with the Buddhist. Very few people who identify themselves, there are now quite a few of them on this campus, they will call themselves Confucians because it's like self-praise.
Okay.
I say, I'm an upright person, or I'm a good person, or you trust me, or something like that. Normally, you don't call, that's the reason why in most discussion, 儒者, actually, it's a high praise. So they say, oh, no, we are not 儒者, we are 儒生, we're students of Confucius. In 1985, when I taught a course on Confucian philosophy at Peking University, virtually no one say, I am a Confucian. They consider that as totally irrelevant. They can study it, analyze it, criticize it. They cannot be. But right now, people who actively identify themselves as Confucians are numerous. Some of them become Confucian fundamentalists. And they identify themselves as Confucians and refuse to accept others as true Confucians.
Ideology aside,
yes.
Well, we can say you're someone who believes in Confucian values.
Yes.
That's for sure. Even starting from your teenage years,
right,
till now, all the past decades.
Yeah. In other words, my life history, my personal life history, is intertwined with Confucianism and how you define it. And for this, I wouldn't use the word benefit.
What's the biggest influence, I would say?
Well, the influence is personal identity, personal sense of personal cultivation. And I can say it's a painfully difficult process. And often the label Confucianism has caused me a great deal of agony and frustration because of mislabeling, right? Especially in China. And people just don't believe there's such a thing because it's been criticized. On the other hand, precisely this gives me a great deal of inner strength of trying to follow a sustainable way of life. And I think that in a way, when you identify yourself with the tradition, you actually, maybe in an unconscious way, you actually want it to be good, want it to flourish. But I always maintain a critical stand. So when people criticize Confucianism, to me, I don't feel offended. I feel it's fortunate that I have a chance to listen to this kind of criticisms.
You're also being referred to as the representative of New Confucianism. What exactly does it mean, New Confucianism?
Actually, I don't particularly like the expression New Confucianism. You know, just like a new human being, this is the term the Japanese used some time ago. Before long, people try to coin new human beings. So when you say New Confucianism, some people say, well, I'm not a New Confucian, but I'm the post-Confucian. Or some people say I'm a new Confucian. But the third epoch, the idea of the third epoch, or the idea of Confucianism in the 21st century, that's something I like. And I think something very new happens. It never happened since Confucius. That is a global context. Now, the third epoch, meaning that it's able to face up to the challenges of modernity, of the Enlightenment legacy of the West successfully. And theoretically, we already figure out a path, a way. But the practice is painfully difficult.
Tu says it is time to believe for a Confucian revival in China and the world, for Western values cannot adequately address humanity's condition. Talking about, say, the revival of traditional values, not necessarily maybe Confucian values or Confucian classics, and there are so many classes now being designed to educate the young kids with the classics. How do you see this?
Not just the young kids, but successful entrepreneurs and responsible government officials. So this is a widespread phenomenon. This is, I think, a cultural renaissance. In the long run, it could turn out to be extremely consequential. It is not returning to the classical tradition. It is a representation of the Chinese idea of cultural identity. There are now quite a few scholars who spend all the time talking about Confucianism in the country and try to talk to communities, local communities. So this is no longer something academic. My sense, this is a change of the mindset. And this is one of the reasons why I believe that the terms such as 良知, such as 仁, or 义理智, these terms gradually will regain its mana, which means its intrinsic power. And that no longer is simply something that you say it without particular meaning.
Well, those classes for classical studies, and they're now being organized with private classes or business, commercialized training courses. Right. Do you think that will be eventually included in the regular curriculum?
And inevitable. It is really inevitable. How it's going to happen, we don't know. It requires a lot of adjustment, but it's totally inevitable.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for your time, and thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.